December 18, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Steiner pressed his eye against the tiger's gunner's sight, watching the tree line through sheets of falling snow. His hands, steady despite 3 years of combat across 2 continents, rested on controls that commanded 88 mm of German engineering superiority. The Tiger Eye's main gun could penetrate any Allied armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. American Shermans, by contrast, needed to close within 500 meters to have any hope of damaging his frontal armor. At least, that's what every training manual, every briefing, every combat report had taught him. In 6 months of fighting from Normandy to the Belgian border, he had never seen evidence to suggest otherwise. His crew had destroyed 42 enemy tanks without suffering a single penetrating hit. The Americans called his tank the Tiger. His crew called it invincible. Both were about to learn how thoroughly one unexpected engagement could shatter 3 years of absolute certainty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The journey to this moment of reckoning had begun in the summer of 1943, when Klaus Steiner first laid eyes on the massive steel beast that would become his home. The Henschel factory in Kassel had completed Tiger number 251,384 just 3 days before his arrival, and the smell of fresh paint still lingered inside the turret when he climbed through the commander's hatch for the first time. The statistics were impressive enough to make any tanker feel immortal. 100 millimeters of frontal armor sloped at minimal angles, immune to anything the Soviets or Americans could field. Side armor of 80 mm that could shrug off hits from medium tank guns as if they were rifle rounds. The legendary 88 mm KWK-36 main gun, adapted from the fearsome anti-aircraft weapon that had destroyed so many Soviet tanks at ranges the enemy couldn't even return fire from. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, the training officer at Paderborn, had stood before Klaus's assembled crew with the confidence of a man stating mathematical facts rather than military doctrine. The American Sherman carries a 75 mm gun that cannot penetrate your frontal armor at any practical combat range. Their newer 76 mm gun poses minimal threat beyond 500 meters. You possess every advantage. Superior armor, superior firepower, superior optics, superior training. One Tiger is worth 5 Shermans in combat effectiveness. Perhaps 10, if the crew is skilled. His gunner, Underoffizier Martin Keller, had grinned at those words. Martin was 23 years old, a former machinist from Stuttgart who could estimate range within 50 meters by eye alone. He had joined the Panzer forces believing in German technical superiority the way other men believed in God. Absolute. Unquestionable. Proven through the mathematical certainty of armor thickness and muzzle velocity calculations. The loader, Gefreiter Hans Becker, was a farm boy from Bavaria who had never seen a tank before conscription. He treated the 88 mm rounds with religious reverence, handling each shell as if it contained the concentrated essence of German industrial might. Which, in a sense, it did. Each armor-piercing round weighed 23 pounds and could punch through 5 inches of hardened steel at 1,000 meters. The Americans had nothing comparable in their inventory. The driver, Gefreiter Otto Wagner, had worked in his father's automotive repair shop before the war. He understood the Tiger's Maybach engine the way a musician understands his instrument. Every sound, every vibration, every subtle change in performance told him exactly what the machine needed. The Tiger's mechanical complexity demanded such intuition. With its interleaved road wheels and sophisticated transmission, the tank required constant maintenance and attention. But when properly cared for, it moved with surprising grace for a 57-ton monster. The radio operator, Gefreiter Ernst Müller, completed the crew. Ernst was a quiet man from Hamburg who had studied engineering before the war. He maintained their communications equipment with obsessive precision and kept a notebook filled with technical observations about every engagement. His records would later prove invaluable in understanding what happened in those frozen Belgian woods. Their first combat had come in July 1944, 2 weeks after the Normandy invasion. Klaus's Tiger was part of Schwerpanzerabteilung 503, rushed to France to contain the Allied breakout. The unit had been held in reserve near Cannes, waiting for the inevitable American armored thrust that intelligence promised would come any day. The morning of July 18 brought that thrust with overwhelming force. Operation Goodwood sent 3 British armored divisions toward the high ground south of Cannes, and Klaus's company found itself positioned directly in their path. Through his commander's cupola, Klaus watched what appeared to be the entire British army advancing across open farmland. Hundreds of tanks, mostly Cromwells and Shermans, moving in formations that seemed to stretch to the horizon. The sight should have been terrifying. Instead, Klaus felt only a cold certainty. The British were presenting their armor at ranges where his 88 could engage with impunity while their guns remained effectively useless. Martin Keller needed no orders. His first shot at 1800 meters struck a Cromwell directly in the glassy plate, and the British tank exploded with such violence that its turret cartwheeled 30 meters through the air. The second shot, 5 seconds later, penetrated a Sherman's frontal armor and the American tank slewed to a halt, smoke pouring from every hatch. The third shot missed by inches as the target tank frantically reversed. The fourth shot didn't miss. In 12 minutes of combat, Klaus's crew destroyed 9 British and American tanks without receiving a single hit in return. The enemy shells that did reach their position bounced off the Tiger's frontal armor with sounds like hammers striking an anvil, each impact confirming what they already knew. They were invincible. The psychological impact of that engagement shaped everything that followed. Martin Keller had whooped with joy after each kill, his confidence growing with each successful penetration. Hans Becker had loaded shells with increasing speed, his farm boy strength proving invaluable as fatigue set in. Otto Wagner had positioned the Tiger with tactical precision, using terrain to maximize their advantages while minimizing exposure. Ernst Müller had calmly relayed targeting information and coordinated with other German tanks, his engineers' mind cataloging every detail for future reference. By the time British artillery forced them to withdraw, Klaus's crew had become true believers in Tiger invincibility. The pattern repeated throughout the summer. At Villers-Bocage, Klaus's Tiger destroyed 3 Shermans in as many minutes from a concealed position overlooking the main road. The American tanks never even saw where the shots originated. Their return fire struck buildings, trees, and empty streets while the Tiger remained untouched in its carefully chosen position. Near Falaise, a desperate American counterattack sent 6 Shermans against Klaus's position. The Americans advanced with admirable courage, using smoke and terrain to close the range. But courage couldn't overcome physics. At 800 meters, Martin Keller began firing. At 600 meters, 4 Shermans were burning. At 400 meters, the remaining 2 tanks retreated behind a stone wall. Klaus could have pursued, but doctrine taught that Tigers didn't chase prey. They dominated kill zones and let the enemy come to them. The mathematics of tank combat in 1944 seemed to favor the Germans absolutely. A Tiger's 88mm gun firing armor-piercing rounds generated muzzle velocities of nearly 3,000 feet per second. At 1,000 meters, these rounds retained enough energy to penetrate 4 inches of armor plate angled at 30 degrees. The Sherman's frontal armor measured 2.5 inches at the thickest points, angled at approximately 56 degrees. The physics were brutal and simple. German rounds went through American armor like bullets through cardboard. American rounds bounced off German armor like stones off castle walls. The training manuals reinforced this superiority with precise data. American 75mm guns could only penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at ranges under 300 meters, and only with perfect perpendicular hits. Even the newer 76mm guns that started appearing in August 1944 couldn't reliably penetrate Tiger frontal armor beyond 500 meters. The Germans could engage and destroy American tanks at ranges where return fire was physically impossible. This wasn't propaganda or optimistic assessment. This was measurable, repeatable, documented fact. Klaus's crew developed a routine born from repeated success. Ernst Müller would spot targets at maximum range using the Tiger's superior optics. Otto Wagner would position the tank to maximize armor protection while providing Martin clear lines of fire. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Martin would estimate range using the sophisticated German range-finding equipment, then adjust for wind, temperature, and target movement. Hans Becker would load the appropriate ammunition based on target type and range. Klaus would confirm the target and give permission to fire. The system worked with mechanical precision because German engineering had created mechanical precision. By September 1944, Klaus's Tiger had 42 confirmed kills without a single penetrating hit. The crew's confidence had evolved beyond mere belief into absolute certainty. They had tested the superiority of German armor technology in the only laboratory that mattered, actual combat against desperate enemies. Every engagement confirmed what the training manuals promised. Superior German engineering created superior battlefield results. The Americans compensated for technical inferiority with numerical superiority, which was exactly what inferior powers always did throughout history. The mathematics were simple. Germany built better tanks. America built more tanks. Quality versus quantity. The ancient equation of warfare. But something had begun changing in the American approach that Klaus and his crew didn't fully understand. Throughout the autumn of 1944, American tank tactics evolved in ways that the German intelligence summaries didn't adequately explain. Shermans began operating in larger coordinated groups, using suppressing fire and maneuver in patterns that seemed almost Soviet in their disregard for casualties. American artillery became more responsive, more accurate, more devastating. Close air support appeared with frightening regularity whenever weather permitted. The Americans were learning, adapting, and innovating in ways that pure technical specifications couldn't capture. The first hint that something fundamental was changing came in early November near Metz. Klaus's Tiger engaged what appeared to be a standard Sherman platoon at approximately 1,200 meters. Martin's first shot struck the lead tank perfectly, penetrating the turret ring and destroying the Sherman instantly. The remaining American tanks didn't retreat as expected. Instead, they split into two groups and began rapid bounding movements, using terrain and smoke to close the range while maintaining heavy suppressing fire. The volume of incoming rounds, though ineffective against the Tiger's armor, made target acquisition difficult. By the time Martin could fire his second shot, the range had closed to 800 meters. The second shot destroyed another Sherman, but now the Americans were firing from multiple angles, their rounds striking the Tiger's frontal and side armor in a drumbeat of steel on steel. Otto Wagner had maneuvered skillfully, keeping the thickest armor toward the greatest threat, but the Americans were coordinating their movements in ways Klaus hadn't seen before. One group would advance while another provided covering fire, then the roles would reverse. They were closing the range through disciplined fire and movement, accepting casualties as the necessary cost of getting their inferior guns close enough to matter. At 600 meters, Martin destroyed a third Sherman. At 500 meters, a fourth. But the remaining two tanks had reached positions where their guns could theoretically penetrate the Tiger's side armor if they achieved perfect hits. Klaus had ordered withdrawal, not from fear but from tactical prudence. The Americans had demonstrated a willingness to trade 3 tanks to destroy 1 Tiger, and the mathematics of attrition didn't favor Germany no matter how superior individual tanks might be. Ernst Müller had noted the engagement in his technical journal with characteristic precision. American tanks demonstrate improved coordinated tactics. Willing to accept significant losses to close engagement range. Doctrine appears to prioritize destruction of German heavy tanks over preservation of American medium tanks. Recommend increased vigilance regarding American tactical evolution. The observation was prescient, but none of them understood its full implications. The Americans weren't just throwing more tanks at the problem. They were developing systematic solutions to the Tiger's technical superiority. December brought the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. Klaus's company received orders to advance as part of the Northern Thrust, pushing through American positions that intelligence promised would crumble under the weight of German armor. The optimism felt forced, artificial, disconnected from the reality of American material superiority that had become increasingly obvious throughout the autumn. But orders were orders, and the Tiger remained the most powerful tank on any battlefield. That fundamental truth hadn't changed, regardless of American numerical advantages or evolving tactics. The first 3 days of the offensive seemed to confirm German superiority one final time. American positions collapsed under the unexpected winter assault. Klaus's Tiger led breakthrough operations that shattered undermanned American defenses. They destroyed isolated Sherman platoons caught by surprise, overran artillery positions before the guns could be repositioned, and generally achieved the kind of dramatic advances that had characterized German operations in 1940. The ghost of Blitzkrieg seemed to have returned, and with it the old confidence that superior German tactics and technology could overcome any material disadvantage. But the weather that had grounded Allied aircraft also created the conditions for what would happen on December 18. The snow fell heavily that morning, reducing visibility to less than 300 meters. Klaus's Tiger was positioned on the eastern edge of a small Belgian village whose name he never learned, covering the main approach road that intelligence indicated would be the route for American counterattacks. The village was a collection of perhaps 20 stone buildings arranged along a single main street, with dense forest pressing close on 3 sides. Civilian inhabitants had fled days before, leaving empty homes and abandoned possessions scattered in hasty evacuation. The position was tactically sound. The Tiger's frontal armor faced the most likely avenue of American approach. Stone buildings provided concealment while allowing clear fields of fire along the road. Forest on the flanks would channel enemy armor into the kill zone where German guns could engage at optimal ranges. Otto Wagner had positioned them perfectly, the Tiger's bulk hidden behind a collapsed stone wall with only the gun and turret visible to approaching enemies. Martin Keller had prearranged key positions along the road, noting landmarks that would allow rapid engagement of targets as they appeared through the snow. Everything was prepared according to doctrine and experience. Ernst Müller monitored the radio, listening to reports from other units in the division. The offensive was stalling. American resistance was stiffening. The weather that had protected German columns from Allied air power now protected American reinforcements moving into defensive positions. The surprise was wearing off, and with it the advantage of momentum. But Klaus's position remained secure. One Tiger in a good defensive position could hold off an entire American tank company. They had done it before. They would do it again. The sound reached them before visual contact. The distinctive rumble of radial engines and the clatter of tracks on frozen ground. Otto Wagner tensed at the controls, ready to adjust position if needed. Hans Becker checked his ammunition load for the 5th time, ensuring easy access to armor-piercing rounds. Martin Keller pressed his eye against the gun sight, searching the swirling snow for targets. Ernst Müller confirmed radio communication with company headquarters, reporting contact imminent. Klaus scanned the approaches through his commander's cupola, mentally reviewing engagement sequences and fallback positions. The first Sherman appeared through the snow at approximately 400 meters, emerging from the forest track like a steel ghost. A standard M401 model with the familiar rounded hull and short-barreled 75mm gun. Martin had the target acquired instantly, the crosshairs centered on the Sherman's glassy plate. The range was closer than ideal, but still heavily favored the Tiger. At 400 meters, the 88mm gun would punch through the Sherman's frontal armor with absolute certainty. The American tank couldn't possibly penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at this range. Every engagement, every training exercise, every combat report confirmed this fundamental truth. Klaus gave the order. Fire. Martin squeezed the trigger. The Tiger's 88mm gun roared, the massive cannon recoiling smoothly in its sophisticated mounting. Through the gun sight, Martin watched the tracer arc across the snow-filled space and strike the Sherman's glassy plate at the precise aiming point. The hit was perfect, textbook, exactly where German doctrine specified to penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor and detonate the ammunition storage. The impact should have been catastrophic. The Sherman should have exploded in a fireball of penetrated armor and detonating shells. Instead, the German round struck the angled frontal plate and deflected upward with a shower of sparks, gouging a deep scar across the Sherman's armor but failing to penetrate. The American tank kept coming. For 3 heartbeats, Klaus's mind refused to process what his eyes had seen. The shot had been perfect. The range was optimal. The target was a standard Sherman, not some new model with upgraded armor. Martin Keller's marksmanship was flawless, proven through 42 previous kills. There was no possible explanation for that round failing to penetrate. None. The mathematics didn't allow for it. The physics couldn't permit it. Yet the Sherman was still advancing, its gun traversing toward the Tiger's position with mechanical precision. Martin Keller fired again, this time aiming for the Sherman's turret ring where armor was thinnest. The second round struck exactly where intended and once again failed to penetrate, deflecting off the turret face with another spray of sparks. The Sherman's gun flashed, and an American round struck the Tiger's frontal armor with the familiar hammer blow sound they had heard hundreds of times before. A sound that had always meant nothing, that had always confirmed German superiority. This time, something was different. The Tiger shuddered from the impact in a way Klaus had never felt before. No penetration, but the force of the hit suggested a projectile with far more energy than any 75mm round should carry. Ernst Müller shouted a warning from the radio operator's position. More tanks, multiple contacts, moving through the forest on both flanks. The Americans weren't just sending one Sherman. They were deploying a full company, perhaps more, coordinating movements through the dense terrain that doctrine said was impassable for armored vehicles. Klaus grabbed his binoculars and scanned the tree line, counting muzzle flashes through the snow. 6 tanks. 8. 10. More emerging every second. All advancing with the same mechanical determination as the first Sherman, all firing rounds that shouldn't pose any threat but were shaking the Tiger with each impact in ways that previous American fire never had. Martin fired a third time at the original target, now at 300 meters. The shot struck the Sherman's lower glacis plate where armor was theoretically weakest. The round deflected again, carving another deep groove across the American armor without penetrating. The Sherman fired back, and this time Klaus heard a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The distinctive crack of armor penetration. The American round punched through the Tiger's frontal armor just below the gun mantlet, exactly where German engineers had promised no Sherman gun could possibly penetrate at any range. The interior of the turret filled with fragments of shattered steel and pieces of the penetrating round. Hans Becker screamed, his left arm torn open by a fragment the size of a man's thumb. The main gun's hydraulic traverse system began leaking fluid where another fragment had severed a pressure line. Klaus's mind was racing through impossibilities trying to find rational explanation. The Sherman's gun was wrong. The silhouette was correct for a standard 75mm, but the muzzle velocity and penetrating power suggested something far more powerful. The American round that had just penetrated their frontal armor had demonstrated performance characteristics that no 75mm gun could achieve. Which meant either the Americans had developed a new weapon that intelligence hadn't reported, or the Tiger's armor was failing in ways that contradicted every specification and test result. Neither option made sense. Both were happening. Otto Wagner was already reversing the Tiger, backing through the collapsed wall that had provided concealment. The Maybach engine howled in protest as Otto demanded maximum reverse speed from the sophisticated transmission. The Tiger could manage approximately 12 km per hour in reverse, which was faster than most tanks could achieve but felt agonizingly slow with American rounds striking the armor every few seconds. Each impact shook the 60-ton vehicle like hammer blows, and each one carried the possibility of another penetration. Martin tried to return fire but the damaged traverse system responded sluggishly and the swirling snow made target acquisition nearly impossible at the speed they were moving. More American rounds struck the Tiger's frontal and side armor as Otto maneuvered through the narrow village street. One round penetrated the side armor above the tracks, something that shouldn't be possible from a standard 75mm gun at ranges beyond 300 meters. The round passed completely through the fighting compartment, missing Ernst Müller's head by centimeters before exiting through the opposite side. The radio equipment exploded in a shower of sparks and burning insulation. Another round struck the turret and penetrated, killing Hans Becker instantly and wounding Martin Keller in the shoulder. The inside of the Tiger had become a steel coffin filled with smoke, screaming, and the acrid smell of burning electrical equipment. Klaus managed to get the wounded crew out through the commander's hatch as Otto Wagner brought the Tiger to a halt behind a thick stone church wall. The American tanks hadn't pursued immediately, which suggested they were consolidating their position rather than pressing their advantage. Martin Keller was bleeding heavily from his shoulder wound, barely conscious. Hans Becker was dead, his body still slumped over the ammunition racks. Ernst Müller had burns across his face from the exploding radio equipment but was otherwise functional. Otto Wagner emerged from the driver's compartment shaking, his hands trembling so violently he couldn't hold his weapon. They abandoned the Tiger there in that nameless Belgian village, carrying Martin between them as they retreated toward German lines. The walk through the snow took 4 hours, and during that time Klaus's mind kept returning to the same impossible questions. How had Sherman rounds penetrated frontal armor that should have been impervious? What had the Americans done to their guns, their ammunition, their tactics that allowed such impossible results? Every assumption about technical superiority had been demolished in 12 minutes of combat, and Klaus couldn't construct any rational explanation for what he had witnessed. The field hospital was overwhelmed with wounded from across the stalling offensive. Martin Keller lost his arm to infection 3 days later, the antibiotics in short supply and reserved for cases with better prognosis. Klaus sat with him the night before the surgery, and Martin kept repeating the same phrase through morphine-induced delirium. The shots were perfect. Range was optimal. The math was right. The shots were perfect. He died 2 days after the amputation, sepsis spreading faster than the inadequate medical supplies could combat. His last words were mathematical calculations, range and deflection formulas muttered to an audience that couldn't save him. Klaus spent 2 weeks in that hospital, officially diagnosed with minor shrapnel wounds but actually suffering from something the doctors couldn't treat. The certainty that had sustained him through 3 years of warfare had been shattered as completely as the Tiger's armor. He lay awake each night, replaying the engagement in his mind, searching for tactical errors or equipment failures that might explain the impossible. There were none. They had done everything correctly according to doctrine and experience. The Americans had simply rendered that doctrine obsolete through innovations that German intelligence had failed to identify or German engineering had failed to counter. Other Tiger crews began arriving at the hospital with similar stories. Oberleutnant Werner Fischer's tank had been destroyed near Bastogne by what he swore were standard Sherman 75mm rounds that somehow penetrated frontal armor at 600 meters. Feldwebel Johann Krauss reported American tanks using ammunition that created penetrations far exceeding what specifications said was possible. Every survivor told variations of the same impossible story. American guns that shouldn't work were working. American armor that shouldn't hold was holding. American tactics that shouldn't succeed were succeeding. The pattern was too consistent to dismiss as individual error or bad luck. Something fundamental had changed in American capabilities, and German forces were paying with their lives for intelligence failures that left them unprepared. Klaus requested transfer to a technical evaluation unit, desperate to understand what had destroyed his crew and his certainty. The request was denied. Germany needed experienced tankers in combat roles more than it needed investigators examining impossible American capabilities. He was assigned to a new Tiger crew within a month, this time as gunner rather than commander. The demotion stung less than the knowledge that he would be climbing back into a tank whose supposed invincibility he no longer believed in. The new crew consisted of strangers who hadn't yet experienced what Klaus had witnessed. Their commander, Lieutenant Stefan Richter, spoke with the same absolute confidence about Tiger superiority that Klaus had once shared. Superior armor, superior firepower, superior optics. The familiar litany of technical advantages that combat experience had revealed as incomplete truth at best and dangerous delusion at worst. Klaus said nothing during the briefings, unable to articulate doubts that contradicted every training manual and combat report. How could he explain that perfect shots at optimal ranges had failed? That American rounds had penetrated armor that mathematics said should be impervious? The other crew members would think him coward or incompetent, searching for excuses to justify his previous crew's destruction. Their first engagement came in early January near the village of Hoefeleis. 3 Sherman tanks appeared through morning fog at approximately 800 meters, advancing in the bounding overwatch pattern that American crews had perfected. Lieutenant Richter gave the order to fire with complete confidence. Klaus centered his crosshairs on the lead Sherman's glassy plate, calculated the range with the precision Martin Keller had taught him, and squeezed the trigger. The 88mm round struck exactly where intended. The Sherman's frontal armor deflected the shot with a shower of sparks, the tank continuing its advance without pause. Klaus fired again, aiming for the turret ring. Another deflection. The Sherman's gun flashed, and their Tiger shuddered from an impact that sounded wrong, that felt wrong, that carried energy no 75mm round should possess. Lieutenant Richter was shouting something about ammunition malfunction, demanding they load different rounds, unable to accept that the problem wasn't German shells but American improvements. Klaus fired a third time at 400 meters, watched another perfect shot deflect off armor that specifications said should be vulnerable, and knew with absolute certainty that his second Tiger crew was about to die just like his first. The American round that penetrated their frontal armor killed Lieutenant Richter instantly and wounded their loader. Klaus managed to bail out through the gunner's hatch as smoke filled the fighting compartment, dragging the wounded loader with him. The Tiger burned behind them, another 60 tons of German engineering superiority reduced to scrap metal by an enemy whose technical inferiority existed only in outdated intelligence assessments and desperate propaganda. Klaus walked away from his second destroyed Tiger knowing that whatever the Americans had done to their tanks and ammunition, German forces had no answer for it. The intelligence reports finally began circulating in late January, too late to save the Ardennes offensive but early enough to prevent complete ignorance about American innovations. Klaus read the technical summaries with the attention of a man studying his own death warrant. The Americans hadn't developed a miracle weapon. They had done something far more dangerous. They had applied industrial problem-solving to the tactical challenge of destroying Tigers, and they had succeeded through systematic innovation rather than revolutionary technology. The reports detailed multiple parallel improvements. American metallurgists had developed new armor-piercing rounds with tungsten cores that dramatically increased penetration at all ranges. The rounds weren't fundamentally different from existing ammunition, just manufactured to tighter tolerances with better materials and more sophisticated propellants. Industrial quality control rather than scientific breakthrough. The improvements were incremental but cumulative, each small enhancement combining with others to create dramatic performance increases. The Shermans themselves had been modified with improved armor packages, additional plates welded to glacis and turret that increased effective thickness without requiring complete redesigns. The modifications were field expedient rather than factory standard, American crews and maintenance units adding protection based on combat experience rather than waiting for official upgrades. The approach was pragmatic, flexible, and utterly unlike German doctrines that required central approval for modifications. American tankers were engineering their own survival while German tankers waited for solutions from distant factories. The tactics had evolved most dramatically. American doctrine now emphasized overwhelming Tigers through coordinated platoon actions that accepted losses as the necessary cost of closing engagement ranges. 3 or 4 Shermans would advance simultaneously from different angles, using suppressing fire to disrupt German gunners while closing to ranges where their improved ammunition could penetrate Tiger armor. The approach traded American numerical superiority for German technical advantages, and the mathematics of attrition favored the side that could replace losses faster. Klaus understood finally what had destroyed his crews. Not superior American technology or tactical genius, but systematic problem-solving applied by a nation with unlimited industrial resources. Germany had built the better tank. America had built the better system for countering better tanks. Individual superiority meant nothing against coordinated improvements across ammunition, armor, tactics, and doctrine. The Tiger remained technically superior to the Sherman in almost every measurable category, but technical superiority alone couldn't overcome American willingness to innovate, adapt, and sacrifice. The war ended for Klaus in March 1945 when his third Tiger was destroyed by American artillery near the Rhine. He survived with burns and shrapnel wounds that would leave permanent scars but rob him of no limbs or organs. The injuries were sufficient to merit evacuation to a hospital in Bavaria, where he spent the final weeks of the war recovering among the ruins of the nation whose technical superiority had proven insufficient against American adaptability. The Tiger crews he met in that hospital all told similar stories. Perfect shots that didn't penetrate. American rounds that shouldn't work but did. The systematic demolition of certainties through combat experience that contradicted every training manual and intelligence assessment. Germany surrendered in May, and Klaus found himself among the millions trying to rebuild lives from the wreckage of absolute defeat. He returned to his family's machine shop in Dortmund to find the building bombed into rubble and his father dead from starvation during the final winter. The work of reconstruction began with clearing debris and salvaging whatever tools and equipment remained functional. The physical labor was manageable. The psychological reconstruction proved more difficult. Klaus couldn't stop thinking about the Tiger engagements, couldn't stop analyzing what had gone wrong and what lessons might be learned. He began corresponding with other survivors, comparing experiences and technical details, building an unofficial database of German armor failures that official military histories would never acknowledge. The pattern that emerged was clear and damning. German technical superiority had been real but insufficient. American industrial adaptability had been underestimated to the point of strategic blindness. In 1947, Klaus received an unexpected letter from the American occupation authorities. They were conducting technical assessments of German armor capabilities and wanted to interview experienced Tiger crewmen. Klaus agreed to the interview more from curiosity than cooperation, wanting to understand what the Americans had done to his tanks. The interview lasted 3 days and covered every engagement in exhaustive detail. The American technical officers listened with professional interest, asked precise questions about German tactics and equipment, and finally explained what Klaus had faced in those Belgian woods. The Sherman that had destroyed his first Tiger had been firing 76mm high-velocity armor-piercing rounds with improved propellant and tungsten penetrators. The ammunition was designated M93 and had been developed specifically to counter German heavy armor. The rounds could penetrate 100 mm of armor at 500 meters when striking at optimal angles, which made Tiger frontal armor vulnerable at ranges German doctrine considered safe. The Americans had distributed this ammunition to selected units during the Ardennes offensive without updating their tanks' external appearance, which meant German crews couldn't visually identify which Shermans posed lethal threats. The American officer explained the development process with casual precision that Klaus found more disturbing than the technical details. American metallurgists had analyzed captured German armor, identified vulnerabilities in thickness and angle, then engineered ammunition specifically optimized to exploit those weaknesses. The process had taken 8 months from initial concept to field deployment, a timeline that German bureaucracy couldn't hope to match. The Americans had treated Tiger superiority as an engineering problem to be solved rather than an immutable fact to be accepted, and they had solved it through systematic application of industrial resources. Klaus asked why German intelligence had failed to identify these improvements before the Ardennes offensive. The American officer shrugged with the casual indifference of someone explaining obvious facts. Your intelligence apparatus was collecting information, but your command structure wasn't adapting to it. Multiple reports about improved Sherman performance reached German headquarters throughout the autumn of 1944, but they were dismissed as exaggerations or explained away as crew error. Your doctrine was too rigid to acknowledge that technical superiority could be overcome through incremental improvements. The assessment was delivered without malice but with complete confidence, and Klaus recognized the same certainty he had once felt about Tiger invincibility. The Americans understood that warfare was fundamentally about problem-solving rather than technical specifications, and they had built systems that prioritized adaptation over perfection. German engineering had created magnificent weapons. American engineering had created flexible systems for defeating magnificent weapons. The difference had proven decisive. Klaus spent the next decade working in reconstruction, applying mechanical skills learned in Tiger maintenance to rebuilding German industry. He married in 1949, had 3 children, and built a modest life from the ruins of absolute defeat. But the Tiger experiences never left him. He dreamed regularly about the moment when perfect shots failed to penetrate, when American rounds punched through armor that mathematics said should be impervious, when certainty shattered as completely as steel under high-velocity impact. In 1958, Klaus attended a reunion of former Tiger crewmen in Munich. Dozens of survivors gathered to share memories and compare experiences, finding comfort in collective acknowledgement of shared trauma. The conversations inevitably turned to the question none of them had satisfactorily answered. How had Germany lost the armor war when German tanks were so clearly superior? Klaus offered the explanation he had developed through 15 years of reflection. We confused technical superiority with strategic advantage. The Americans understood that warfare rewards adaptability more than perfection, and they built systems that could evolve faster than we could maintain superiority. The other veterans listened with varying degrees of acceptance. Some still clung to explanations about numerical superiority or betrayal by incompetent leadership. Others recognized the same truth Klaus had learned. That absolute certainty about technical advantages could become strategic blindness when enemies refused to accept those advantages as permanent facts. The Americans hadn't built better tanks. They had built better systems for countering German tanks, and the distinction had proven more important than any specification comparison. Klaus died in 1987, his 3 children grown and his grandchildren scattered across a reunified Europe that would have seemed impossible during the war. His obituary mentioned military service but provided no details about Tiger crews or Belgian villages or the moment when American rounds penetrated armor that should have been invincible. Those memories belonged to a generation that had learned through bitter experience that technical superiority alone was never sufficient for victory. The lessons had been written in the shattered remains of Tiger tanks across Europe, in the lives of crews who died believing in invincibility, in the systematic demolition of certainties through combat experience that contradicted every doctrine and assumption. The Tiger remained the most powerful tank Germany produced during the war, superior in almost every measurable specification to American designs. But specifications measured capabilities rather than outcomes, and outcomes depended on far more than individual technical advantages. The Americans had understood this fundamental truth and built their strategy accordingly, accepting short-term losses while developing long-term solutions to German armor superiority. The approach had proven devastatingly effective, and German tankers like Klaus had paid the price for their nation's failure to anticipate American adaptability. In the villages and forests of Belgium, rusted Tiger hulks remained for decades after the war, silent monuments to the moment when American engineering overcame German superiority through systematic innovation rather than revolutionary breakthrough. Klaus had climbed from 2 of those burning hulks, carrying wounded crewmates through snow while his certainties burned behind him. The physical scars healed within months. The psychological transformation lasted a lifetime. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.